This presentation that I'm going to share with you today arose out of the work that I've been doing on a digital community reconstitution project for the Jewish community of the famous steel town of Homestead, Pennsylvania, about a 20-minute drive from where we are presently. To identify the people in this community, I read through many different kinds of records like those you see here on this slide. Key to my efforts were the town's censuses and directories, which I read through for the available years. In so doing, I discovered a strange situation in the census for enumeration district 144 of Homestead's 3rd Ward in 1920. It was enumerated by a young man named Henry Silverstein. Here is one of the census pages that Henry created. As I did with every page of every Homestead census I've read, I skimmed through the list of families looking to identify Jewish or possibly Jewish families. This page names people in 7 households on the 200 block of West 15th Avenue. Reading across each row adds numerous biographical details, including their and their parents' birthplaces and native languages. On this page, I noted the Hirsch family, indicated in the blue box. The rows for parents Louis and Ethel indicate that their parents were Yiddish speakers from Russia. So this sure sounds like a Jewish family for me to add to my database. Throughout enumeration district 144, I found other families with Russian Yiddish origins: the Ryavs, Hucksteins, Plessets, Cohens, and Kamens. The Engelman, Goldman, and Rosser families from Germany, Russia, and Poland were not listed as Yiddish speakers, though other clues like names and professions suggested that they might be Jewish. The Hirsches in these 8 other families, 50 people in total, had not shown up in my research before. So I tried to search for them in genealogy record databases to see what more I could find out about them. Here is what I found for Ethel Hirsch. Nothing. The profiles for all 50 of these people are similarly empty. I could find none of these people in any other records, an unprecedented situation in the hundreds of enumeration districts that I have reviewed in this way. Moreover, looking more closely at Ethel, I don't see any related records linked to her 1920 census entry. And I don't see any record hints attached to her profile in my tree. And same goes for all of these other new, possibly Jewish people that I found in ED 144. The matching algorithms that are used on this commercial website are partially based off the crowdsourced record links that are created by genealogists who use these records to research their own ancestors on this website. So when I kept seeing no related records or hints for any of these people, I began to think that it was because no one else was researching these people, because they are no one's actual ancestors, because maybe they're not real people at all. Now, if I was going to make an assertion that crazy, clearly I had to back it up. So I decided to do something similarly crazy and research all of the households in enumeration district 144. As a shortcut, I tried to match them in the 2 Homestead town directories that bookend the 1920 census, the 1918 census and the 1918 directory and the 1921 directory. If I found a person from the 1920 census in one or both directories, that sure suggests that this was a real person. They're in 2 data sets that were totally unrelated. Of course, the absence of a person from both directories doesn't automatically mean that they were fake. Homestead had a transient labor population, and the directories had a 3-year gap between them. So when I found someone who didn't match, I did follow-up research to see if they turned up in anything else. In total, with all of this research, I found 81 unmatched households with 448 unmatched people. You can see here how the match rates change on the far right, page by page. You can see that from January 2nd to 6th, Henry was doing legitimate work. His work declines in quality on January 7th, and thereafter, I find no matches for any of the people that he recorded. You can begin to formulate a story of what happened here, but I suspected that there were other patterns lurking in this data that would explain why. The pattern most relevant to us here today is the geospatial arrangement of the matched and unmatched households in ED 144. For this, I partnered with my frequent JS collaborator, Lauren Winkler, whom some of you hopefully heard her amazing telegraph presentation earlier today, or go look for the video if you haven't. Now, much of ED 144 in Homestead appears today as it did in 1921. So for most of the addresses, Lauren was able to use current address point geocoding. For addresses that don't exist anymore, Lauren manually placed them by referencing their location on old sandboard maps of Homestead, like the one that you see here. This solved the problem for a street like Joseph Street, which in 1920 had numerous homes, as you can see on the map, but today has no buildings left, only a gas pipeline running through it. One additional challenge was that the address data in the census itself was quite dirty. In some cases, Henry recorded the wrong address for a household. Here, he put Joe Shivitz and family at 800 West Street, an address that is actually 6 blocks away from the addresses of the households that Henry enumerated before and after. And this mistake became obvious when we saw the very distant pin on an early version of our map. Consulting the historic sandboard map, plus the city directory entry for the same man, shows that the correct address was 108 West 14th Street, actually around the corner. Sometimes the modern-day transcriber was the one who made the mistake. You can see here where Henry turned the corner from West 14th onto Sarah Street, but the transcriber did not notice that and incorrectly typed into this commercial census database that all of these people still lived on West 14th. Now, this mistake became obvious when we couldn't geolocate these addresses because the actual numbers on West 14th end in the 300s, but these house numbers are in the 1300s. Finally, there were some mistakes that we did not detect during address geolocation or mapping, but only when we animated our map. Now, it looks pretty clear that this house number is 1405, which fits with the sequence of odd numbers clearly reflecting Henry's walking down one side of the street. This transcriber, however, typed it in as 1406. It was too subtle a difference to pick up on the static map, but as you'll see, it's pretty obvious in this animation. Now, with no further ado, let me present to you the resulting map showing where I was and was not able to match households to other records after all of this data cleanup. But there's a new surprise on this map. Do you see that black boundary on the left? That is Henry's actual enumeration district, the area that he was assigned to canvass. I had expected to see all of the pins inside of this box. Now, when I initially saw this map, I thought that Lauren had made mistakes geocoding some of the addresses, defaulting to East 15th or East 14th for addresses that really were West 15th or West 14th. But when I looked more closely, I saw that the mistake was not hers, it was Henry's. The pins on the right of the map outside of that black box are 5 pages of households that were not in ED 144, but Henry canvassed them anyway. So here already we see one shape in the data that cannot easily be determined just by reading the raw data, and it begins to fill in why Henry resorted to faking so many households in the end. But there's more that I see on this map. Note all of the blocks within that black box of ED 144 that have no pins. Compare that with my mapping of all of the relevant households in the 1918 Homestead directory. Do you see now how many households he just plain skipped? Finally, this mapping exercise reveals a final layer to Henry's fraud, one that to me clinches that it was intentional fraud. In the end, Lauren and I were only able to map 83% of the addresses. The reason for this? Henry placed 32 of his 78 fabricated households, 41% of them at fabricated addresses. And here I attempted to show where Henry imagined those households to be. For example, remember the Hirsch family and their neighbors whom I told you about at the beginning? Henry placed them on the 200 block of West 15th. But there is no such block. This street has always skipped from the 100s to the 300s. This is indeed an alarming, audacious, and illegal deception. But I have pity on Henry for the challenges that he faced in enumerating Homestead's residents, challenges that ultimately overwhelmed him. The first challenge that Henry encountered was the large number of foreigners living in Homestead. The second is that families of all backgrounds mistook enumerators for burglars, scammers, and especially creditors, and tried to evade them. But in this particular steel mill town, where these particular foreigners encountered strange government agents at this specific historical moment, these factors converged more than average because at the time the 1920 census was taken, Homestead was at the tail end of the Great Steel Strike, during which the labor activists who took part were tarred as foreign Bolshevik agents. Ongoing red raids through this period, which restarted on the second day of the census with massive nationwide arrests, led people to hide from enumerators that they mistook as federal agents. In a mill town like Homestead, the ongoing efforts to defeat the strike created an atmosphere of paranoia amongst the workers and their families that may have particularly hindered enumerators. The final challenge was the freezing weather that overtook the Pittsburgh region on the day Henry and all of the other enumerators began their work. So with all of this context in hand, let's return to the map that Lauren and I assembled to walk through the full narrative of what Henry did and why he did it. On his first day, whether Henry found friendly or unfriendly people, whether they were eager or reluctant to speak to him, he managed to gather reasonably accurate information for the households he visited, although he did miss some along the way. He probably got quite cold in the process. Crossouts on his early entries do suggest that the work was proving challenging for him. You don't typically see this in the census. His next day of canvassing was the coldest day of the winter, 1 degree Fahrenheit, and perhaps even unfriendlier as the latest red raid struck close to home. Still, though, he visited an appropriate number of homes, although again he missed at least 5 households, but he gathered reasonably accurate information for those he got to. And then, at some point during that frigid day, he realized that he had made a horrifying mistake. Every house he'd canvassed so far was located outside of the boundaries of his district. Now, in order to explain why Henry made this mistake, I need to show you one final map, in fact, a copy of the very map that the Census Bureau gave Henry. The map that Henry referenced is upside down from Homestead's actual geography, but his map indicated that nowhere. Henry got off the streetcar in Homestead near 15th and West and, guided by his upside-down map, turned left instead of right, and for 2 days he had no idea that he was on the wrong side of West Street. So after 2 cold days of hard work, Henry had nothing usable. He had Sunday off to sit at home and dwell on his mistakes. On Monday, he began afresh on the other side of West Street. He was in catch-up mode and visited a pretty decent number of homes that day. Tuesday, he continued, but it appears that he visited very few homes. Misordered pages around this day suggest that the work continued to challenge him. Wednesday, the weather was high of 30, warmer but still freezing. A new round of local red raids dominated the news. It seems Henry set out that day with no remaining patience to do the job correctly. The first household he visited that day, he fabricated. A few on the next block, fabricated. The last 2 from that day, fabricated. Were the actual residents not home? Were they reluctant to speak to him? Whatever the reason, Henry made up households of fake people and moved on to the next door. He ended the day with 6 fakes, hidden amongst the 22 new households he had recorded. He awoke on Thursday to worsening weather. The temperature was dropping. Freezing rain and snow were predicted. Henry determined to knock on no more doors. As best as I can tell, he sat at home and filled out the rest of his enumeration pages with fake people, many living at fake addresses, and he didn't even try to make it seem like he had visited every block in his area. Henry's gamble paid off. He did not get caught. His pages look legit to his supervisors. Heck, they even look real to me, knowing what I know now, that every person and every address on this page is fake. Now, there are tells in this data, but they are not apparent just by reading the pages. This unusual case reminds non-cartographers like myself that the often overlooked geographical dimensions of our data sets are key to determining underlying patterns in the history that we are studying. And all the difficulties of mapping this data point to inherent challenges in trying to do mapping exercises like this one at scale. Census data in general is dirtier than most researchers realize, and the kinds of address mistakes that we saw earlier are extremely common. Cartographers need to fact-check census address data against contemporaneous sources, the same as any other data set needs to be validated. Nevertheless, these are challenges worth finding ways to overcoming. There are many ways that researchers try to retroactively assess the actual quality of historic and recent censuses. I suspect if we could more easily visualize which neighborhoods, which blocks, which houses did and did not get recorded, we would see shocking patterns into who got counted and who did not. And since it appears I have some extra time, I have a little denouement for you. As far as I can tell, as I said, Henry got away with his fraud, and afterwards he decided that government work was to his liking. The 1930 census recorded him as a laborer working for the city. The 1940 census recorded him as a clerk in the district attorney's office, and the 1950 census recorded him as a clerk in the prothonotary office. The census, of course, just sketches the outlines of a person's life at 10-year intervals. In between the 1930 and 1940 censuses, Henry had a temporary change of address because he got caught committing a different fraud entirely. Vote tampering. Henry served a year and a day in Lewisburg Federal Prison from 1935 to 1936. So Henry did get caught for something, but census fraud of the sort that Henry committed is exceedingly rare. I'm in the process of working with the group in BYU's economics department to assess how often this kind of fraud happened. While our work is still proceeding, we're down to something like 400 pages of 2.4 million sheets in the entirety of the 1920 census. So that's fewer than 0.1018% of sheets in the 1920 census, where the difference between the predicted and the actual match rate is in the same range as Henry's obviously fake sheets. So we're still checking our data and tweaking our algorithm. I think we're going to learn some things from those sheets to tweak our algorithm further, but it's clear from what we're seeing that what Henry did is pretty unique, and we can all agree that this case of Henry is definitely something rare and fun and hopefully somewhat educational for the more normal kinds of cases that we research. Thank you.
Utterly fascinating, thank you. But in my experience, it's a lot of hard work to come up with a bunch of fake given names as well as fake surnames. And so I wonder if you have run any analysis on Henry's other pages to see where he might have gotten them.
Every time I see one of those last names in some other source in Pittsburgh, I take a little screenshot and put it in a file folder. That Ryav last name that might have sounded so odd to you, that's a Jewish family that I know from Pittsburgh. Huckstein, I think, has a local plumbing company or something. So I think these are the data's good enough, when he puts the jobs, he's clearly invoking real places, he's clearly using names that he's used. One of the biggest tells, actually, is that he created far too many Jewish families. There were really only 2 Jewish families living here, one that he caught and one that he skipped. So I suspect you could look at some other differences as well, where in the fake data, some of those characteristics don't actually match up to the real people, where he's just clearly using his imagination of people that he knows in the world, suggesting that they worked at Homestead Steelworks, Mesta Machine, some random broom factory that I can't track down. But the truth is, people don't do this because it requires a ton of creativity to be able to pull it off. I mean, there was a lot of other paperwork that I didn't get into that he had to submit to make it seem like he had really done this. I think most people would say it was better just to keep going in the cold and to figure this out. That's why he's special. Is there time for one more?
Yes, this was great, just to echo that. The question that I had is, on that first day when he turned left instead of right, instead of left, does that mean that those families are double counted in the census?
I got one better for you. Some of them are triple counted. I left it out because of time, but there's another version of this map where I have different shades of green. The lightest one that you saw if they're enumerated once, and then darker if they're enumerated twice or 3 times, because every single person in the third ward got completely confused. They all were on each other's blocks, and in fact, there is a newspaper article where it says there's been some confusion, you might be enumerated twice, please put up with this. So I think they all got confused by that map. They did not resort to fake data because they were not clever enough to do it. Thank you.